Hi, everybody. My name is Michael Laine. I'm the president of Liftport Group, and we're about 3 years ago, at the very, very beginning of the pandemic, we had to make a shift away from doing work on the lunar space elevator infrastructure, just to survive the financial chaos of the pandemic. And as part of doing that, we wound up creating this subsidiary, betterfutures.space. And in the course of that, we wound up running about 27 different virtual conferences as a service. So that was a really big part of our revenue model for the last many months. But now, as the world is once again changing, the revenues of a conference as a service has really shifted to more of a hybrid product where there are going to be more conferences that are in person and have a digital component. So we did that just a few weeks ago with the Mars Society. So super happy with those guys. Thanks to them for having us do that. And then as we transition, doing less and less conferences for clients, we're also starting to move towards doing podcasts. So this is a new thing that we're doing, the DareGreatly Space Podcast Series. And that's really kind of fun. This is only our fourth one so far, so pretty excited. We've had a space lawyer, Kobina Hughes. We just had James Burke last week, the director of the Mars Society, and then Dr. Andrew Aldrin, professor at Embry-Riddle. So what we're doing is we're going through the money of space, finance, capitalization, commercialization, because we don't really think that this $500 billion industry is necessarily getting the attention that it deserves. This is a new world that we're moving in towards, and we're pretty excited about it. But I don't think many people are really paying attention to the money. And I think if you miss that and just get wowed by the cool technology that's coming out of it, you're gonna have some problems. So in the coming weeks, as we move into December, we've got Dr. Robert Zubrin, again from the Mars Society. We've got Dr. Roger Lanius, who was the former, now retired NASA chief historian, and then went on to run the curator at the director at the Air and Space Museum at the Smithsonian. And we've got Rich Bowling coming in from Redwire. So we've got some really great stuff coming up in the next few weeks. Definitely stay tuned to that. I'd like to point us towards the Eventbrite page if you want to see what we're up to and what's happening and what's coming next. And with that, let's bring in our guest this evening. I'm a big fan of Laura Forczyk. She's been on our shows many, many times, 15 times maybe. It's been a lot. Out of 27, that's a pretty good batting average. So good. We really, really like having you on our show. For people who have seen our shows before, I usually do just a short, generic bio, and we're not doing that anymore. I usually just read off a scripted bio that they've presented to me. But instead, with our new format, what we're going to do is we're going to dig a little deeper into our guest's background to discover a little bit about how did they become who they are, right? How did they get into this field? Where did they come from? If people know me, I like talking about landmines and quicksand, things that caught them up in one way or another, because I've had my own quicksand and landmines moments. So It's not just all about rainbows and kittens. We want to look at, this is a difficult business to be in. It's a bit difficult industry to be in. So how did these folks that have gotten on our show, how did they become who they are? So we're going to spend about 10, 15 minutes going into Laura's background. And then we're going to shift into the larger context of space commercialization. And then we're going to bring it back to her directly. So with that, Laura, really great having you here. As you know, I'm a big fan of you and the work that you're doing. So can you just give us a bit of a background, and we'll dig into it a little bit further, but just give us the short version right now.
First off, thank you again for having me on, Michael. Thank you for your warm hospitality with all of things that you get to speak on. I'm always pleased to come on all of the different programs that you have. And also shout out to Terry and Isaac in the chat. Thank you for joining us live. So I grew up as a science geek, as a space geek in particular. I have evidence. I have a written piece of paper in a notebook that said that when I was in 3rd grade, I wanted to go to the moon. And it's this little short story I wrote about being an astronaut, going to the moon, and what I would bring and what I would do on the moon. And I don't know if maybe that was inspired by something I'd read or heard about with the Apollo program. I myself am an elder millennial, so I was way too young to be around during the Apollo days, as much as I wish I was. So I'm really excited about Artemis. But that love of space, and particularly the moon, it captivated me. It was one of those things where the moon was just the beacon in the sky. And my parents gifted me a telescope when I was somewhere in my early teens. I want to say like middle school age. It was just this little basic telescope, right? But it was enough to look at in our backyard or our front yard. We lived in the suburbs of Philadelphia, up at the sky. And that was like, okay, I love space. My parents then realized that there was space in Huntsville, Alabama. And so they sent me when I was in middle school. In fact, they sent me twice in middle school and twice in high school. And then I was grateful to be part of something called NASA Academy at Marshall Space Flight Center, which is a NASA internship. I was an intern one year and then helped run the program the next year. And I went to space camp for adults in Huntsville twice. So I've been to space camp 6 times. But it started in middle school, as many of these interests do with children, right? I did not lose it in high school. It stayed with me. And then I found this love of physics in particular. I've always loved math. I remember just like competing in math unofficially to be the best math student in middle school, but physics captivated me. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to go to school for astrophysics. So that's exactly what I did. And I was, again, in Philadelphia, and it was cold. And so I wanted to move south. So I looked at all the locations with a NASA center in warm weather, and I ended up at Kennedy Space Center area, Florida Institute of Technology, where I got my bachelor's degree in astrophysics. And my senior, actually between junior and senior years, is when I got that internship at Marshall Space Flight Center that I was just referencing, NASA Academy. And then I paired up with the scientists that are working there. People think about Marshall Space Flight Center, they think about rockets and propulsion. Well, they actually do high energy astrophysics that is just overlooked over there. And there was this team there that brought me on board. They're like, we want you as a graduate student. I'm like, okay, I'm going. So I ended up going to Huntsville for my master's degree. Once I made the decision to switch over to something more hands-on, because with astrophysics and with a lot of the sciences, it's a lot of computer programming. And I realized that was not my thing. I wanted something a little bit more hands-on, but I didn't necessarily want to go into engineering. So I switched over to the University of Central Florida in Orlando, where they were working on what I call experimental planetary science. There was a laboratory setting, and we did these drops of impactors, marble, into lunar Regulus simulant. And so we were essentially testing low energy impacts into moon, Mars, asteroids, anything that has a dirty or dusty body. And, at that time, it was very vague. At the time, NASA was in a transition between its like Journey to Mars program and its Artemis program here. And so initially it started out with any planetary body that has dirt and even Saturn's rings. But then with my love of the moon, always with me, it transition to, okay, this is a moon project. This is us trying to figure out, what happens if we have a soft impact on the moon.
Okay.
And that introduced me to research being done at Kennedy Space Center, doing impacts, jet impacts, propulsion, retro propulsion impacts, for example. How do you land on the moon, for example, that kind of thing. On the, when we have these kinds of jets, landing into the surface with a low gravity well, then that regolith is going to go everywhere. It's going to sandblast everything. We've already seen this with the Apollo program. Already seen how coarse and harmful regolith on the moon can be. And so that was the kind of stuff that I researched, both low energy and high energy impacts of the regolith on the surface of the moon. I got snatched up before I finished my PhD there, and I started working at what's known as the the International Space Station U.S. National Laboratory, or CASIS is the acronym for the parent program there. And I was one of their scientific analysts, where I was looking at all of the research that can be done on the International Space Station. That's microgravity research. That's also technology development, anything like radiation that might be exposed. If you put outside of the ISS, there's actually places where you can test material science payloads to the radiation environment, or even astronomy or planetary science. There was meteor trails, for example, going through the atmosphere, things like that. Anything on the physical sciences side is what I was taking care of, because we had a very, very tiny science team at that time, and I was the first physicist that they hired. So at that point, I'm like, all of it. I was handling any physical science experiment that this tiny nonprofit was running. Now, CASIS is specifically set up to handle payloads on ISS for the benefit of life on Earth. And so that might be separate from thinking about space, like for the benefit of going outwards into Mars and beyond, or benefit of how astronauts could live long term. This was particularly to help humanity or help life on Earth. So Earth observation, for example, medical research, although that was the other side of the science team, anything that had to do with that kind of work, where I traditionally had been thinking. I had my eyes to the stars, and I hadn't necessarily been thinking about down back on Earth. So it was a really good practical experience for me to get an overview of all of the research that is in space that benefits life on Earth, which is tremendous. People just have no idea, who don't work in the industry, just don't know how much is done. And then from there, I got snatched up by a startup. There was a startup based in Switzerland that was planning to do point-to-point suborbital transportation. So you don't know what that is, audience members. That is when you have some kind of vehicle, usually like a space plane, or it could be SpaceX Starship, so it could be a large vehicle, but some kind of vehicle that goes to suborbital space, so not all the way orbiting the planet, but only going to a little bit and then coming back down to Earth. And we have seen this with Virgin Galactic and with Blue Origin, but they go and land approximately where they started from. Whereas point-to-point transportation, it's transportation. It's meant to fly you halfway around the world very quickly. That's the business case that has yet to be proven. So this company was trying to build. Sorry.
When was that?
That was I want to say like 8-ish years ago. 8-9-ish years ago. Swiss Space Systems. You might remember them. That was I was one of 2 employees in North America. I was the only employee in Florida. I was handling all of the operations for all the setup, everything having to do with the Florida, Kennedy Space Center, Space Florida, FAA, all of the organizations that you'd need to operate. Because we weren't just starting out with space, we were going to start out with ZeroG flights. So if you might have heard of ZeroG Operation, that flies the Vomit Comet kind of 2 of those campaigns. They are amazingly fun. I did actually get sick on one of my flights. It was actually not a ZeroG Corporation flight. It was actually a NASA flight before NASA retired its plane. It was 40 parabolas. If any of you know, ZeroG typically does 25 parabolas, and I was getting sick towards the end of 25 parabolas. So halfway through 40 parabolas, I got sick and had to be strapped down.
No.
But it's so worth it. So worth it. And so why do you do that? Because it actually is a way of getting microgravity without going to space. So just like drop towers, if you drop something ceiling to the floor, which we built an apparatus in our lab at UCF that dropped something from the ceiling to the floor in our laboratory. That gives you free fall. It gives you weightlessness. I'm going to be using these terms interchangeably. But, you know, aside from that, you might have like a roller coaster or a drop, you know, things like Tower of Terror at Disney, for example. But aside from those, and those only give you a split second, you know, like very short times, you go in these parabolas and you're diving in this plane, and that gives you 25 seconds of free fall. Amazing. So you are literally floating like astronauts, but there's that transition between ZeroG and 2G, ZeroG, 2G, and that makes you sick. At least if you don't take medication, which I didn't. And so the company that I was working for, they wanted to build one of these planes and raise funds that way and prove the concept that they could operate a vehicle and then transition to creating an apparatus which then launched things into space, little satellites, and then also use that funding to do point-to-point transportation for humans. Didn't work out. Company went bankrupt.
Okay.
I was actually 9 months pregnant with my first child when I was clearing out the office at Kennedy Space Center. They had cut off health and care. They had already stopped payroll like months earlier, and they like given me a little bit of money for every like quarter. They gave me a little bit of money, but they owed me about half a year's salary. And I was over here literally about to give work like 2 weeks before I gave birth, something like that, clearing out the office at Kennedy Space Center, wondering what in the world am I going to do. And by the way, I endless gratitude to my immediate boss at the time. It wasn't his fault. You know, talking about things that you learn from, you know, you learn from the fact that the people at the very top, the management in Switzerland, they did not know how to run a company. There was a lot of shading going on that I didn't realize. I hadn't done my research to look into the founders of the company. But my immediate boss really like got me through that period, because that was a pretty dark period of like what do I do now. I don't necessarily regret working for a startup. It was a learning experience, but it was financially difficult at a most difficult time when I'm transitioning to motherhood. But that pushed me out of my comfort zone to become an accidental entrepreneur. That's what I call myself, because I intended to be a business owner. I went to school as a scientist. I have no business training. I've never taken a business class. And so here I was with a brand new baby, a newborn, creating my own company. I started my company, you know, a couple of weeks after my baby was born officially. I intended it to be just part-time at first, consulting. Astrological is the name of the company. That first year was so rough because I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know how to run a business. I didn't know what my business case was. I didn't know what clients I was supposed to be going after. I had 2 really bad clients that first year. That second client actually made me want to quit. Like, I thought I was going to give up on the company after a year because I was just so miserable with the clientele that I had gotten and the lack of success, until I restructured in the second year, figured out what clientele I wanted and what I wanted the company to stand for. And it has still been a learning experience, don't get me wrong, but that second year was so much better. And every year since, I learned how to run a business, you know, how, all the things that you have to be a successful entrepreneur. And I still have a ton to learn, but that's why I have people around me which help me to teach me the things I don't know about running a business. And then from there, actually just this month, I have spun out a segment of my company where Astrological is just focused on serving businesses, government entities, and organizations that want space career consulting, or space industry consulting. And then I spun off the space career aspect to the company. So now I have a separate where I do space career coaching, which I've been doing now for 6 years, just under the Astrological umbrella. So Astrological is just my consulting business, and then I also have a space career coach helping mid-levels and executives who are either wanting to transition into the space industry. Maybe they've always wanted to work in the space industry and they have never really figured out a way in, or they've been trying and they haven't gotten the jobs, or they're overwhelmed with all the choices because the industry is vast. Or maybe it's an investor or an executive that wants to expand their business or expand their portfolio, and I really help them figure out where they belong. And so that's what I do. That's and I guess I should mention I'm also an author. I published 2 books already. Rise of the Space Age Millennials. I published that in 2020, about the millennial generation working in space and what we hope to accomplish. This year in January, I published Becoming Off-Worldly, which is really a guide to how to become an astronaut in the modern day age, learning from astronauts what they couldn't train for or didn't realize would be surprises to them, didn't realize would impact them so much. And also looking at people who were flying commercially, who bought tickets, who, some of them are waiting for the rides, some of them have actually flown since I published the book, and looking to see what they're doing to prepare holistically, that is physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And I created a community, an online community for people who want to go to space, for people who are serious about preparing themselves holistically for space. And that's becomingoffworldly.com. And I'm currently working on my third book to expand on some of the topics from that second book about, how do you prepare to go to space, and how do you get everybody to go to space for all, right? And that includes people who are not able-bodied. So people with various disabilities, either visible or invisible disabilities, and what these spaceflight providers or space station designers, what everyone is doing to prepare for a world that is more just and able to accommodate a huge segment of population, about 20-25% of the population who is disabled, and any one of us can be disabled anytime. And so it's an area where we don't want to leave these people behind. We don't want to leave a large segment of humanity behind. Disability is actually a social thing in a lot of ways, where you have glasses, I have LASIK surgery done. We would be disabled without vision correction. We just don't think of it that way. So society has accommodated us, right? But in so many ways, society has not accommodated people with various disabilities, and therefore they're left out of the picture. And I'm just trying to raise awareness of the fact that there are people out there with minor tweaks that are excellent candidates to go to space, and why should they be left out?
Right on. I love that. Let's talk about some of the landmines. You kind of talked about, the company, and you said, you didn't necessarily do your homework. You didn't know that much about the character of the people at senior levels of management. Let's dig into that a little. Let's dig into any other landmines or things that you kind of wish you had avoided, or lessons learned from that. Where do you want to go with that?
One of the most important things that I've determined from, my career experience and my consulting experience is the character of the people at the top matter. Who's at top? What is their worldview? How do they care about the employees under them? What are their motivations? What is their grand vision? And how are they accomplishing that? I think that beyond anything else in a company is one of the most important things to look for, because if somebody is running a company, they could be, they could have all the good intentions, but if they don't know how to run a business, the business might fail. And that was not the case of the company that I worked for, the startup I worked for, where they, I think they had good intentions with what the technology was, but they had poor intentions financially. And there was actually a scandal, and a lot of the articles are in French, so I have to try to figure it out. But there was a whole scandal about the guy who was the CEO of the company I used to work for, who really defrauded people. And so that was the kind of thing. I did not do my homework. I did not look at the person at the top. I looked at my supervisor, and I determined him to be of character, but I did not do my research about the founders, about the management team, and it makes so much difference. Are they capable of doing what they say they're going to do? Are they realistic? What's their track record, if they have any? Some people are straight out of college or still in college and starting companies. So that's both, a positive and a negative. They're fresh experience and new innovations and all of that, but they might not have the experience to actually run a business, but they might be thinking ahead and thinking that I need to hire people with business experience. And therefore, a lot of times engineers are the ones starting these space companies. And most of the times, they're not the right persons to be running the company. It should be someone with more business experience, for example. I myself am in this category where I'm a scientist and I was not necessarily the right person. I should have gotten someone from the start to help me run a business or to teach me how to run a business, because that was a complete learning experience. So looking at the people at the top, especially when it comes to what they've done rather than what they say they're going to do. Because a lot of people in this industry dream, and that's something I love about this industry. We are dreamers. But to make things happen, you need to have the qualifications, you need to have the competence, you need to have the funding. Money is another thing that runs the industry, right?
That's why we're doing this.
Yeah, so that could be
money,
it could be government funding. Sorry?
I said cash flow runs this industry, and no one's really tracking it. No one is paying attention to it there are a few
Oh, I wouldn't
organizations.
say that. There are some. I would say that there are some groups that are tracking this very
Well,
well. I'm not.
I would
deal with
say
the financial
those would be the exceptions. I would say that most people just in the industry or even outside our industry are not paying attention. I would, hat tip to folks like Bryce and Space Angels and Euroconsult and a few others. They're doing terrific work, but I don't know that information is getting out beyond some very, very thin slices of the ecosystem.
It definitely depends. So
Yeah.
we saw over the past 2 years or so, the SPACs, the special purpose acquisition corporations, really pop up, not just in the space industry, but that was a real trend, like throughout the United States. And it slowed down once the United States put some barriers in place, but you still see it happening in the space sector. You still see some SPACs, and it's not necessarily a negative, but I would say it's a big red flag. So a company should probably be having some kind of profitable operations before they try to go public. It's my personal opinion. Again, I don't have a financial background. I'm not a financial lawyer, but just based on what I've seen, almost all the companies that have gone SPAC, have gone IPO through SPAC process have not been doing well at all. Some of them might be delisted. So these are the kinds of things to think about. Now, there are other ways to go public, of course. And sometimes the traditional ways of going public aren't getting the benefits either. But I would say it really depends. Like sometimes you'll see investors that just went in on that action, and maybe they can't invest in SpaceX like they want to, so they invest in something else that is space related, and they think that's a proxy for SpaceX. Or sometimes an investor really does do their due diligence, and I have worked with a couple of investors, and it's a mixed bag. It really is. Sometimes they spend a lot of time understanding the industry, and they're really well informed, and sometimes an investor just goes in on the hype, or they don't want to be left behind. But investing is all about having that portfolio, and you're going to have some losses in there. So it's about taking those risks. And I'm not an investor, so I really can't speak to that kind of philosophy. But I would say that there are some people paying attention. It's just when it comes to the public, I feel like we in the space industry do a poor job of communicating, and we hype up the industry so that it is unrealistic. And
we're all really excited about it. Like we can
be excited without saying that we're going to land on Mars in 2030.
Right.
Because we're not going to land humans on Mars in 2030, because we're not. We're struggling to land people on the moon, which we've already done. We're struggling to land people on the moon by the end of the decade, which I believe we will. I believe we'll land people on the moon by 2027-ish. But we're not landing people on the moon by 2030. And that's the kind of excitement I love to see, but it's so unrealistic that people hear that. I remember Mars One, for example, and people outside of the space sector contacting me and saying, did you hear they're going to send people on a one-way trip to Mars? And people believed it, because the general public just doesn't. And that's just one example. There's been so many throughout history of just hyping things up that never happen. And there are some people who disagree with me and think that's okay, and that it's okay to be dreamers, and it's okay to have these lofty aspirations. But I think the idea to be more realistic with what we tell people, especially people who are not following closely, so they don't get decisions, so they don't make the wrong decisions, so they don't put all their fun area and neglect funding in another area.
Yeah, absolutely. I got hired 2009. Kind of around the same time frame. No, I guess that was a little earlier for you than you. I got hired, and on day number 3, I was an officer of the company. On day number 3, I had my first "I quit, you're fired" conversation with my boss, and because I asked to see the books, I asked to see the numbers, and immediately all these red flags are going off. And coincidentally, also a guy from Switzerland that I didn't know. I knew several of the people that were my peers as technical advisors, and I trusted them, but I didn't know the main guy, the two main guys. Week number 2, I had the same argument with them, and month number 4, I basically had a decision of stay with the company, don't stay with the company. Candidly, I liked the paycheck, and I hadn't had one for a while, so I was really looking forward to it. And then month number 4, I'm like, I'm out. I'm done. And 4 people in that company went to jail. I preserved all of my documents because I thought I was going to wind up getting subpoenaed. Ultimately, I didn't, because they spread their company across Spain, the United States, Canada, Bahrain, UAE, and somewhere else I forget. But yeah, there's a lot of people in this industry that are very sketchy, and it kind of helps to have been around as long as you have, as long as I have, to kind of know who the characters are in the field. And there's new people joining this field all the time. And that's probably good, but then you don't know their history. You don't know their track record. And I've certainly seen people with some pretty fantastical LinkedIn profiles that just make me kind of scratch my head and wonder, really? Because this industry is really close. Like, we can verify stuff. That's the advantage of having folks like us be around for a long time, is we can go out and actually make a few phone calls to people who know people. And that's, I think that's one of the reasons why you're good at what you do. And I think that's one of the reasons why I've had such really interesting guests on our show, because we can make phone calls to people that have been around. So yeah, definitely keep your radar pinging, because there are some interesting people out there that are completely above board, that have had some really bad days. I know of literal billions of dollars that have just evaporated in this industry through, bad management, early to the mark, having the wrong technology, having the wrong systems, changes in administration, both at NASA and the federal level. There's billions of dollars that have just evaporated in this field.
But that does tie back to a criticism of the general public of why are we wasting money in space, because it doesn't evaporate. It goes towards paying people. It goes towards innovating to new technology. So even some of these companies that go bankrupt, they still contribute technology. They still contribute a little bit to the grander picture. So for example, asteroid mining companies that went bankrupt several years ago now, that technology was acquired. And I'd like to think that something good will happen with the work that was done, and the people who were paid, they learned something. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing that, companies go under, companies might be too early, companies might be mismanaged. I mean, it's unfortunate, but it happens in every industry. I think I think one thing that we realize here is that it's so insular. The space industry is so insular. We don't really talk to other industries as much as we really should. And so we think that it is unique to the space sector, but it's not. We shortcut by saying the space industry, but there is no space in, or use data from space. It's all so many industries. It's all the industries, and it's very interdisciplinary and very transdisciplinary. So one of the things that to look for is how insular is a company. Who are their customers? And if the customer is a company that hasn't been profitable yet, as we're seeing pop up. I mean, I love all this activity with, like, for example, cislunar space. Cislunar is the term that we use for the space between the Earth and the Moon and the general vicinity of the Moon. Cis meaning near. And so cislunar space is such an exciting, it is something that I love about what's going on right now and the lunar activity that's being planned with Artemis. But so many of these business plans rely on other companies succeeding. And so that's the kind of thing that, it's a chance. You're taking a chance. A lot of companies are now taking a chance on, for example, SpaceX Starship. They're assuming that Starship is going to become operational. By the way, so is NASA. NASA is taking a chance on Starship. But there's a lot of business cases now that are reliant on Starship. And it's chancy. So I don't think it's a bad thing to take these chances. You just have to know the risks that you're getting into.
Right. You've got, you mentioned asteroid mining. Planetary Resources was up here in the Seattle region, They did the very best they could, and then they went out of business. And then the remains of that business, the location of that business, was bought by a local Seattle company, and they're building satellites out of it. Isaac, remind me in the chat. Can you remind me of the company? Because I've just totally gone blank here.
Was that Bradford, or which one was that?
No. So Bradford bought Deep Space Industries resources.
Right. Okay.
The leftovers from that.
All these years later.
Right. And then the other one was, I think they were called Beale Aerospace.
Oh,
it was a guy with a bank down in Texas. He put $100 million into that company of his own money, verifiably, and they went out of business. But then Blue Origin bought his ranch, and they were able to kind of take over those resources to that's where Blue Origin is now. So you're right. These are, yes, while the company failed through a combination of different things, both Planetary Resources and Beale, there's hundreds of people in these organizations, well, probably not hundreds, but at least 50 in Planetary that I know of, and dozens of people at Beale. Those individuals were able to move on. Oh, thanks, Isaac. It was Explore Technologies took over the Planetary Resources stuff. And there's a bunch of those employees who have gone on to create new companies. So it is interesting to see that this industry, if you will, recycles its people, its talent, its assets within the industry. So I think that's really great. There's Seattle has become the small satellite capital of the world now, between the new developments at Kuiper and the ongoing development of Starlink, and half a dozen other small sat companies in the local region. And I would argue that Planetary Resources planted a flag locally, and that's one reason. And some of this stuff has been here for 15 or 20 years. Some of it's been here for a long time. Aerojet Rocketdyne's been here for 30 or 40 years. But it is interesting to watch the money flows of this field, and how XYZ company might go out of business, but it spawns 3 more companies in its place. So I think that's pretty neat. Let's
and you've been around longer than I have. You've seen it. I broke up there. I said I've also seen resurrected companies, because when a company is going to be a phoenix, come back from the ashes, like Firefly, for example.
Yep.
Vector might come from the ashes. Straddle, Master Space bought by Astrological, and I think they might be keeping the Maston name. I'm not sure.
You just made some really important points.
And so we
Laura.
Keep the talent when we can.
You just made some really important points, but your video was a little broken up. Could you just say those again? Because those 4 companies are really, I think, probably important. And how did that happen? If you could dig into that a little bit, that would be great. So Maston, Stratolaunch, Vector, and Firefly. Could you just go a little bit deeper into those? I'm going to go off video because it's really important that we capture our audio.
I don't remember.
Laura, could you cut your video and see if we can boost the audio? Yeah, the videos are kind of important to YouTube, but at the end of the day, this is going to a podcast, so we just want to make sure that we capture the audio. Rat. Okay, I can see you a little bit more clearly. Can you hear me? I'm getting full internet. Folks, we're going to hang on a few minutes and see if she is able to rejoin. It looks like she is. Excellent.
Sorry about that.
Hey, no worries. No worries.
Hopefully
I'm glad
that's a little better.
Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and ask you to go off video, off camera, because while that might be a little frustrating to the folks on YouTube, it's really important that we capture the audio for the podcast. And I want to make sure that we keep our audio. Can you hear me 5 by 5? Sure. Yep, that's better. Yes, thank you.
I can hear you.
All right, so we and you know, Laura, we're gonna we'll cut some of this chaos out of the final podcast. So as Taylor has told me, she's cut about 7 minutes worth of ums and ahs out of the last one. So that this won't be in the final product. But for those folks that are watching on YouTube, we appreciate y'all being a part of this. So we don't want to dismiss y'all, but we want to make sure that we capture the audio. So Laura, could you just back up before we lost the connection and go into those 4 companies that you mentioned who have really had kind of zombie days. They were big companies for a while, then they had zombie days, and then they might be coming back in one form or another, because that's near and dear to my heart. You know a little bit about our history, but the first version of Liftport, working on the Earth's space elevator, we were 14 people before everything imploded. And then we recast ourselves to focus on the lunar elevator, 6 years ago. There's only 5 of us currently. But even then, during the pandemic, we weren't doing lunar elevator work. We started doing media work to stay. So there's something to be said about resiliency and kind of sticking to what you want to do. So talk about those 4 zombie companies and how did they get started? Where, how did they fall? And then how did they come back to life?
Right. So I'm particularly thinking about, for example, Firefly, which in its first iteration, it seemed to be going strong. It had a small launcher concept, and then I believe there was some kind of lawsuit having to do with IP from the founder, and I don't remember the details off the top of my head, but I remember that company went under, and then it reformed. It got new ownership or a new investor, and it reformed as what we know it today, which is Firefly Aerospace, which is now just trying to get its small launcher off the ground. Hopefully will succeed and become profitable. Another company is Vector Space, which it may or may not be coming back. It went bankrupt. It did a small, low altitude test launch here in Georgia, and then it went under. And the CEO got replaced. He went off to go form another company, and it went under new ownership. And the new ownership just posted a press release that was a bit vague as to what the company is going to do, but it looks like that company might be coming back. And there are examples like that of just companies that are resurrected. Stratolaunch was another one, which is not exactly a space company, but it was formed initially to be a type of space company. It's a gigantic plane, the largest in the world by wind tip. I've never seen it in person, but I've heard that when you see this plane in person, it just drops your jaw because it is so huge. And the founder, Paul Allen, he actually passed away. And so his vision sort of passed away with him, but it was resurrected under new ownership with a new mission. And companies like that, you never know when a company might come back from the dead. I remember Bigelow Aerospace sort of came back from the dead a little bit too, and then it's now completely gone. But
Right.
their equipment actually lives on. So there is a module on the International Space Station that is used as a storage area, closet, and that is by Bigelow Aerospace. So sometimes their technology lives on even without them.
Do you happen to know what happened to their assets? Actually, I was wondering about that. Do you know anything about
I
that?
believe NASA got control assets. I think Johnson Space Center, I think.
Okay. Because they had a big facility down in, I don't know, Vegas somewhere, I think, right? There was
I believe
recent,
so.
there was recently a company that was deciding they wanted to build a giant space station, maybe 16 times bigger than the ISS, using some technology that looked really similar. Visually, um, it was, I mean, technologically, it was a little bit different, but the idea of having a super large space station was really pioneered by Bigelow.
Well,
Yeah,
that's another
just
thing to keep an eye on is all these new commercial space station concepts that are popping up. And
yeah.
the ones that are funded by NASA are the ones to really take seriously. There are some other concepts out there that don't have that kind of funding. And to build a space station, I don't care how you do it. I don't care how big, it's going to cost a lot of money. And so really the only ones to take real seriously are the four partnerships, I should say, that have NASA funding. That is Axiom Space, which is going to attach to the space station first and then detach to become a free flyer. There's Orbital Reef, which is headed by Blue Origin. There's Nanobrax and Voyager. They're doing a Star Lab. And of Northrop Grumman is the one that has this contract, and not all of these will survive. So even if you get government funding, it's not a guarantee that your space station is going to exist. But I do love there's technology now being developed to do things a little differently than the ISS. Now, ISS is something that I hold near and dear because I did have that first job working on ISS, but we can certainly improve. The ISS has been operational now continuously for 22 years. That was how long we've been sending people to live on board, and there's new ways of doing things and maybe different users that might want to do things differently. And then there's at least two companies that want to do artificial gravity research for space stations. I'm thinking of Vast Gravitics, for example, and they're not far along yet, so it's hard to judge. But the kind of technology that is so innovative and so brand new, you really have to see who's behind it and what kind of funding they have. Because
so
if it's not both of those in combination, then it's not going to work out.
So I spent some time looking at the Vast website because I was really curious there. And this is not an endorsement, but they're not one of the people, not one in their whole array of images and bios on their website. I didn't know a single person there, and that was both really cool and a little troubling, right? Because I assumed out of 30 people, I would know somebody or be able to reference somebody. So that was both interesting to me, and the source of capital, they're funding this off of one of their guys is a crypto billionaire. And so he's going outside the industry to put this thing together, which I feel is somewhat risky. But I've been saying for several years now that there's an overlap. There's some sort of Venn diagram that brings the crypto wealth people into the space sector. But from just reading LinkedIn profiles, at least a lot of these people in Vast look reasonably qualified. So it is interesting,
but it might be a red flag if you see nobody that is qualified. So if there are people on there whose names you just recognize, and that might be common, especially for non-US companies, because you and I are US based.
This is a US company. That's one of the things
I haven't done my research on Vast yet, so I can't speak to them. But they have enough money, they can start to hire the people who know what they're doing. That's what you want to look for: is are they starting to get a team together that is qualified, that has done some kind of space hardware before? Because if it's newbies doing space hardware, that's not going to work out. You're not going
we're not talking about
newbies.
we're not looking at CubeSat hardware. We're talking about really big satellites that need really big power systems. We're talking about mass production robotics, and so I'm not trying to knock them down, and I'm not trying to endorse them. I'm just saying that there are new entrants into the field, and we really just don't know who's doing what because there's so many things happening here. But I do
is like unrealistic timelines or unrealistic projections. Right. If a company says they're going to launch gigantic, expensive space hardware very, very soon, that's a red flag. If someone says they're going to launch with a higher cadence than SpaceX by 2027, that's a really big red flag. Unrealistic claims then automatically put them in a red flag category to me. It's great to be a dreamer. It's another thing to mislead investors or partners or customers.
Yeah. I mean, we just saw Rocket Lab, again, not throwing anybody under the bus, because catching a falling booster midair in a helicopter is pretty darn hard, right? Mm-hmm. But to go in and say, we're going to build a reusable launch system from day one, that's pretty hard, right? Like, India just announced that they're going to build a reusable launch system. Okay, fine. It's India, it's ISRO resources, so they probably can pull that off. Are they going to do it fast? Probably not. China has announced they're going to do a reusable launch system. They're copying stuff straight off of the SpaceX to-do list. But are they going to do it quickly? Are they going to iterate fast? Probably not. They're claiming to want to build a even larger than Starship spacecraft, 150 tons to orbit. But anybody who's, private companies as opposed to countries have a different level of scrutiny.
And never trust timelines. Timelines are always wrong. Timelines are always going to be pushed back. Right. And it'll be a pleasant surprise if a company actually meets a timeline that says it will. So just expect the timeline to be pushed back.
Well, hats off to you. I want to point out, many months ago, you were on one of our shows, and it was the day or the day after NASA announced that they were going to launch in August, and you came on our show and you said, there's no way. Did anybody plan on hurricanes in Florida? And
yeah, you're talking about the Artemis 1 launch in particular.
Yeah. You had specifically called that out and said, there's no way that's going to happen. And hats off to you. And that's NASA getting their timeline wrong, right? A small company, even a large, well-funded, well-organized company, they're going to push the schedules to the right. It's just going to happen.
There's no incentive for NASA to risk SLS and Orion on Artemis 1 to go speed it up.
No.
So there might be a greater risk tolerance in a smaller company that doesn't have human on the line, for example, to launch things quickly. I'm thinking like SpaceX Starship. I keep bringing up that example, but they build fast to break things, right? That's a different incentive than NASA, which has no incentive to break SLS and Orion. So you just look to see who the people are behind it and what their motivations are.
Yeah. It's this industry is changing so quickly, and there's so much new capital flowing into it, and that means new entrants and new business plans and new crazy big ideas, and it is interesting. It's a little daunting. But I remain excited about it. Even some of the bad ideas that are getting funded, even if there's wreckage, we've already discovered, right? 6 companies during this one conversation that, even though that plan didn't go the way they planned it, the results of them dreaming big have been beneficial to whatever follows afterwards. So that's pretty neat to think about. Before we close off, because we only have a few more minutes, 5 more minutes, let's talk a bit about, your own company, your own entrepreneurial experience. You talked about your new website. You've talked a little bit about your community. Let's dig into your own entrepreneurial pivots and successes and failures.
Well, I already referenced it's very, very difficult for me to start my own business as a scientist and learn along the way. I had to learn how to revalue myself. That was my biggest mistake, I think, because as an academic, we're so used to doing things for free, just expected. It's a service to your communities. So you go and you do everything for free, you volunteer everywhere. And I did for many years.
Yep.
And so I didn't know how to value myself and my time and my results that I get for my clients. And that has definitely been something that I have had to learn the hard way as I've gone on. Is I started out charging very low. I used to do things like, tutor. and I had that kind of price structure of a small amount per hour. And it's a completely different mindset when you run your own company. Another thing I had to watch for were clients who would take advantage of me. So that was one of my biggest mistakes that first year, is getting clients who had no problem exploiting me because they didn't value my time. They didn't value what I was providing for them. And I've had to learn along the way to be more choosy with who I take on as a client because of that. Another thing to keep in mind is, the people that you bring on, the team that you build, making sure that you train them, that they understand what the mission is and what their particular duties are and how they work together in the bigger picture. And, I'm not a natural manager. I had a little bit of training in management when I was a grad student managing undergraduates, but it's different when you're running your own company. So learning that in management, and I'm not a micromanager at all. I myself, coming from an academic environment and getting a PhD, you have to be very, very independent. So I assume that most people are pretty independent and proactive, and most people, maybe they can learn to be, but for one reason or another, maybe some people need a little bit more handholding, a little bit more guidance, or more direction, and just different styles. A lot of things to learn along the way of what I should be doing. So what clientele, what projects contribute to the mission of my company, and which ones are distractions. And so that has been a learning experience as well. It's not necessarily a bad thing to try something new, but then not letting that distract from the overall bigger picture of what I want to accomplish. And so I'm still learning. I'm still learning every day of what it takes to run a successful business.
So how do you decide what clients you want to work with? How do you decide what a project is worth? And I'm not trying to ask you to give up any personal or private information, but what are your criteria? What do you look for? What kind of projects do you want to work on?
One of the mistakes that I continuously made and keep making is working with companies that don't, or startups, or individuals that don't necessarily value what they are getting from me. And so I have to sort of put myself and work and the work of my team on a higher level from the initial conversations, or else there can be misunderstandings. So, for example, a client that is not responsive, to emails or to invoices, or to getting feedback from them. It's always a two-way relationship with a client. And so if I'm the only one making the effort, then it's not working out. Same thing about mismanaged expectations on the other side too. If the client thinks that I'm going to be doing something different than what our contract says, like there's a miscommunication there, then they're not going to be happy, and maybe I don't have the qualifications or the team in place to do what they expected. So really making it very clear, the communication very clear from the start as to what those expectations are, so there's no miscommunication. The best clients are the ones that I feel like I can be, friendly and colleagues with continuously, even when the project is over. And in fact, I have had repeat clients who come back to me, year after year, because they're pleased with my work, and I have that friendly relationship with them where it feels like we are a team together rather than separate. And that is something I truly value. I don't value it more than money. The money is the point of the business, right? but I truly do value those that I feel like I can trust. With the coaching side of the business, it started out with me coaching a lot of students, and I have since raised myself to a price point where I can price out most sort of essentially all students. And so now the clientele that comes to me needs to be committed. That is a big thing. Is I got a lot of clients who would only come for a session or two, very short term, and then they would give up because they're getting results after such a short time. But anything that you try takes commitment, it takes time. And so those are the clients I now look for when it comes to my coaching clients, are people who are committed to changing their careers and will continually work with me for the time it takes to get those results.
Brilliant. And with that, we're going to go ahead and close out the show. Laura Forczyk, we love having you here. We'll definitely be asking you back for some stuff. It's been, as always, you have just so much advice, so much wisdom for our community. We're really grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you again for having me. And your audience can go to astrological.com to read up on reports that we have for purchase there, as well as contact us for bespoke reports or consulting. You can go to www.lauraforczyk.com, where you can learn more about space career coaching and also book me as a speaker if you would like to do so.
Terrific.
Oh,
Thanks.
and join becomingoffworldly.com, Becoming Offworldly community. If you want to go to space, if you're excited about human spaceflight, then you belong with us. So join us.
Absolutely. It's a terrific community. All right, Laura, thank you so much. We'll see you again soon.
Thanks so much. You take care.